Today we're talking about a really controversial story, I think, but I think a really important one. And it really depends on our viewpoint. And that's Matthew's telling of Jesus sending the 12 disciples out to sort of continue what Jesus was doing. This is well before the resurrection. This is firmly placed in Jesus' earthly mission. And, he just basically sent them out to continue what he was already doing. For a short time. And I think for Matthew, the function of this story is priming the pump for a Jewish Christian audience for the Great Commission. Because this is very much like the Great Commission, go out and make disciples to all nations. The dissonance here, and I hope you pick up on it, is that this was very much not to all nations. This was very much to Jewish people only. Not only that, Jesus was pretty harsh in his language about it. Don't waste your time on anybody that's not sort of immediately open to what you're talking about and what you're doing. And communities that, only go to Jewish communities. He's very exclusive about Gentile communities. And only go to, any communities that don't, aren't picking up what you're putting down. Ignore them. It's worse for them than it was for Sodom and Gomorrah, were his words. And that's really problematic. The thing is, it's only problematic if you're looking at it through the eyes of a Christian in 2020 with our colonial history. Because if we're not careful, we're just going to see this as Jesus sending people out to try and add to his number, which I guess is sort of what he was doing. But I don't think that's actually the point of this story. The point of this story is to sort of say that, we've tried. And, to first century Jewish people, Christianity was something they were interested in, but would have found very threatening. And the reason being simply that Jesus was not there to start a new religion. He was there to reform an old one. And people like Matthew had to make the case to these early Jewish Christians and sort of keep them thinking about this, that Christianity was not some new thing, it was a reform on an old thing. That was a tough job to sort of draw people away from their ancestral religion to this new thing that was very different. And one of the key differences was that it was for everybody, not just sons of Jacob being Israel. That was tricky. That was a really tough sell for Matthew. And so I think what he had to do with this passage was say, look, we went to Israel first. And, Jesus said, don't waste your time on people and places that aren't going to listen. Go focus on people and places who are going to listen. And I think what that does is allow Matthew to say, okay, this is why we're preaching the gospel to all nations in the Great Commission. So really, I think it is an inclusive story. It doesn't appear that way to our eyes from our perspective, but it's not really written for our eyes, for our perspective. We're 2,000 years later on the other side of the world. And in those days, Christianity was a tiny little persecuted religion, whereas today it is a giant religion that is done persecuting. So I guess the question is, what do we take away from this today? And I think there's a lot here. And the main thing is focus. Focus on what's important. And the thing to keep in mind about this passage is that this was a short-term mission. I don't think they were moving on from the places that weren't listening simply because those places were bad. I think it was a time thing. If you only have so much time, and this was a short mission, this was in the middle of Jesus' earthly mission, a little segment of that, then focus on what works. If you're going to focus on something that's not going to work, that's a really tough go, and it's a long-term commitment if it's going to work at all. And so I think it's sort of saying keep your eyes on the prize, keep your eyes on what's important. And what's really interesting is it's saying we don't need a lot to do that. Think about how light the apostles traveled. They took minimal stuff with them, and had to rely on the kindness of strangers, and it worked. That's how they did things. I think that's really important. And when we look at today, when we look at what we're doing as Christians today, we have an awful lot of baggage with us. And I say baggage, but really you could also say infrastructure, legacy, things like that. One of the challenges of church in Canada, and I'd even say specific to this part of Ontario, all our churches, our old church buildings, are about the same age. When you look at sort of the old red brick traditional Presbyterian church, they're all about 120 years old. And so they're all reaching the end of their service life at the same time. You can make a brick building like that last a very long time, but it becomes expensive and difficult, and it's hard to do. And all these churches are getting to that period of their life at the same time. Additionally, and actually I'd even say the same of the extension churches. When you look at the last great period of church growth in the Presbyterian church, it was the church extension movement, which was when we were moving out to the suburbs. And those buildings, they're not really built to last. They're buildings with a 60-year lifespan, 70-year lifespan, and that's about how old they are now. So we're in this period where all of our buildings are kind of becoming obsolete, sometimes even dangerous at the same time. But we were building these buildings during this boom, not just of church, but of immigration. Canada was founded from a European perspective in 1867, not that long before St. Andrew's Tweed was formed, and not that long after St. Andrew's Roslin was formed. And we were building churches like crazy, not because there was new Christians, but because there was, existing Christians from Europe showing up in droves. And then, they were moving out to the suburbs in droves, and we were building infrastructure, and the church was at its absolute all-time peak at that time. And we have gone from that peak in 1967, we can pinpoint the year because we have the statistics in Canada, to its absolute valley in 2020. And so we have all these buildings and all this history and all this legacy that was built for a different time, and it's at the end of its service life. And, I'm not trying to make a statement on closing churches or anything like that. I'm just trying to say that this is a tough time. And it's not our faith that bogs us down. It's all the stuff that we've attached to it. And that stuff's important, but at the same time, Jesus sent people out with, bowls and cloaks. That was it. He didn't need all this stuff. And that's a hard sell in Canada where, it's cold half the year. I'd love to do, there's a outdoor worship movement happening, which I think is just great. And I'd love to, this is better than any sanctuary that we'll ever build. And, but it's cold half the year, and we'd like to keep our stuff that we do have indoors. And it's nice to have meeting rooms and things like that. Anyway, my point is just that, Jesus really designed this movement to be really limber, and to be able to just move from thing to thing to thing without really being tied to it. And, we don't do that. It's hard, but we've spent a lot of time building things the way they are, and we kind of like them the way they are. And that's not a bad thing. I understand why we like them the way they are. But at the same time, there's challenges with that. I think the other thing to keep in mind, though, if you're looking at this through the resurrection perspective, giving up on a community or a person or whatever, in the perspective of this story, is not necessarily a bad thing. I like the image of a spaghetti wall. If you're trying to get something to work, or if you're trying to do something new, you throw a pot of spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And what sticks is what you go with. You don't try and do something with the stuff that fell on the floor. You try and do something with the stuff that's stuck. And I think that's what Jesus is doing. He says that for the communities that don't welcome the disciples, it'll be worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. But I don't think that's so much a pronouncement on the communities. I think that's hyperbole meant to motivate the disciples to not get sort of myopic and stuck on this one thing. I think he's trying really hard to just keep them constantly moving forward. This was a short term, I don't know how long it was, but I suspect it was like a month they were gone. They were trying to get as much done in a month as they could, and focusing on things that weren't going to pan out wasn't useful. So here we are in the middle of a pandemic. Things are very different than what we expect, and we can't do the things that we're used to doing. And in Ontario, places of worship have just been opened back up, and obviously we're not in church this morning because we didn't really have a lot of notice I wasn't expecting to be let back in till the fall, and so anyway, we've got to figure out just what we're going to do. But even when we're back, singing is a high-risk activity with the virus. Communion is a high-risk activity. Coffee is a high-risk activity. Human contact is a high-risk activity. Buildings with poor ventilation are high risk. Read churches built in the 1880s. Churches, and people in churches tend to be older and vulnerable people, and it's not going to be the same. But I think this passage is telling us that that's okay. I think it's saying if it doesn't work, move on. That's okay. And again, I'm not advocating to go around and close a bunch of churches or anything like that. I hate to say it, but I suspect a few churches will close through COVID. Churches that were already sort of on the brink, I think it might be enough to push them over. But I read this passage during this time, and I think this is a time to be creative, and it's a time to try new things and not be tied to the old things. And I think that's really exciting. Amen.